Hey everyone, welcome to the third section of the bonus audio section of Doing Content Right. And this is all about really what I think a lot of people are looking for, this idea of growing a podcast. And I'm calling it Land and Expand. How do you really get people to notice your podcast and then expand from there? So, with that said, I think as a caveat before we even dive into the tactics, podcast growth, just as a very friendly reminder, is hard. It's tough. And if you do want to create a podcast, you need to invest just as much in actually growing the podcast, distributing your content as creating it. And this is actually, you might recognize this concept straight from Doing Content Right, because one of the things that I noticed with written content as well is that people tend to, not always, but tend to spend so much time creating the content itself. And then when it actually comes to distributing it, just doing a fraction of the same investment. And with podcasts, this is even more important because we've already talked about the ecosystem being a little behind. And with that, if it's a little behind and you don't have the same distribution mechanisms, you need to work that much harder in actually distributing it. So make sure that if you start a podcast, you're not just hoping the content will speak for itself and that you actually invest in distributing it. So, what are the ways that you can distribute it? Well, I want to talk through three main things, the common mistakes, and then what I advise people to do if they're trying to not make those common mistakes. So the first one is not testing a podcast. The same way that you would build a business and you iterate, you should actually test a podcast and not just start with a hypothesis or a theory and then forever create according to that theory, right? You want to learn and you want to iterate. The second is that people don't make bite-sized content. So they want people to try their podcast. But most of the time when you try something, you need a taste of it, right? You need to have some sliver of what the larger thing is in order to determine if you want to invest in the larger thing, right? But a lot of podcasters do not actually enable their audience in that way. And the third thing is that a lot of people don't reduce the friction to specific events. So if you want people to subscribe to your podcast, to share it, to review it, there are very simple things that you can do to just reduce that friction, and you'd be surprised by how much of a difference that can make if you actually invest in reducing that friction. So the very simple solutions, and we'll talk about each one of them in depth, is to create an MVP. And what that really is a short series of episodes or episode really, and track the success of that particular thing. The second is creating bite-sized, shareable content that can be distributed across channels. In my opinion, this is the most important thing. And then, as simple as it sounds, help people help you. Let's dive in. But before diving in, I think this sets the stage for really why I will focus on those three things. So, in Doing Content Right, we talked about these different social, or not even social channels, rather, these channels to which you can share your content. And I won't go through each one individually, but if you look at the green text here, I'll call out a couple of them. So with social, you can grow a podcast on social, but the content isn't really structured for social. And so you need to restructure it because people aren't going to listen to a 60-minute podcast on Twitter at the time, right? While they're on Twitter. But if you create bite-sized content, that all of a sudden becomes a possibility. In terms of bedrock, where you typically think of Google or YouTube or something that actually has an evergreen nature to it, it's super rare that you'll see a podcast rank for something other than brand search, right? Someone actually looking for My First Million, sure, it'll rank there, but it's not going to rank for other terminology. Of course, there are minor things that you can do, like show notes or transcripts, that enhance your ability to rank for certain things, but it is quite unlikely. Other things to keep in mind are things like targeted channels or viral channels or syndicated channels. A lot of this, the same mechanics apply here, where it's really, really rare for a podcast itself, right? So if you think about the podcast overall, something like the All In Pod, or even a particular episode, it's rare for something as a whole, the whole episode to go viral, or the whole entity of the podcast to go viral. But if you kind of take bits and pieces of any of that content, it can start to actually go viral or be syndicated or be shared in communities or forums or things like that. Another aspect of this is paid, right? So Paid was not a platform that generally I encouraged even for written content. But as you know, paid can get expensive very, very quickly. You can advertise in places like Overcast. But overall, the idea that I'm trying to get across here is that many of the channels that worked before for written content don't necessarily work for audio content, or they can work, but they require you to actually adjust your strategy and not just kind of widely share a podcast episode overall. All right, so in talking through the three main things, the three main mistakes, the first one was this idea of an MVP. And so in this case, you can actually adjust that term and say it's a minimum viable podcast, right? So we already know content is king, right? So the content itself is what's going to determine if you're successful or not. But how do you actually determine if something has legs? If what you're actually creating, the podcast itself, is something people want to listen to if you don't already have an audience of people listening to it? Do you know what I mean? It's more like a chicken and egg situation where how do I test if my podcast can have a sizable audience if I don't have an audience to determine whether they like it or not? All right. Well, in that case, what I often see, and I've mentioned this already, is that people tend to create a podcast, they get an idea for one, and then they just go and create it without really considering how they can learn or improve it, or whether their original hypothesis ended up being true. So here are several very, very concrete steps that I personally am going through when I am creating my own podcast right now, and that I would encourage you to do as well if you are thinking of creating a podcast. And this is actually, I'm repeating myself in ways, but very similar to what I would encourage you to do if you are creating other types of content, not to just think of something, a way to do something, and then forever do it exactly that way, but to learn. So the first thing you want to do is create a pilot episode. Obviously, this comes after the stuff we talked about in section 2, where you're thinking through what you want to create. Assuming you've already done that, create a pilot episode. So this can be a full-length episode, but one that is testing out your hypothesis. And in fact, something I mentioned before is that you can even kind of do a precursor step of sharing your idea on another platform. And by sharing your idea, I'm not saying, hey, everyone, I'm thinking of starting a podcast about X. Do you think you'd listen to it? That's not useful. But taking the same things that you talk about in a podcast and doing a tweet storm, writing an article about it, creating a YouTube video about it, doing these things in other mediums to see if people adhere to it. So that's a first step. And that's what I did when I was thinking through my podcast idea. Now, once you've created your first pilot, focus on feedback. Don't focus right away on distributing it to everyone. Focus on sharing it with a couple people and see if those people end up sharing it themselves, see if it's being talked about, see how they're responding to it. And then as you've shared that pilot episode, you don't even need to tweet about it, right? You can just share it with a couple friends or colleagues or people who are in your target audience. Then you can start getting feedback from a little bit of a wider audience, and the people that you share it with, ask them to rate it from 1 to 10, because often people won't give you candid advice, especially if they are your friends or your colleagues or people you have personal relationships with. So if they're unwilling to give you an accurate assessment of what you've created, ask them to rate it from 1 to 10. And unless they say 10, ask them how it can get to 10. So that's kind of a little hack to actually learn what people really think about what you've created. And of course, be sure to be in the mindset of actually accepting feedback openly and being open to the fact that your original pilot probably won't be great. That's what happened with mine. After you've actually gotten some of that feedback from the people you've shared it with, also kind of nudge them to understand what aspects they did or didn't like about it. So what did they think about the information? What did they think about the entertainment value? What did they think about the voice, the speed, the format? Get them to be precise about what you can improve. Because if they just say overall, I thought it was good or I thought it was bad, that doesn't help you. Perhaps the information is good, but the way you've presented it is really, really ineffective. Now, with all of this information that you've gathered from people, re-record either 1 to 3 episodes. I would say just 1 to start, but if you want to, if you're excited to get started, you can record a couple. And of course, take into these new episodes the feedback that you already received. once you've recorded those new episodes, then you can distribute your podcast more widely. And the specifics of how to actually distribute your podcast will come in some of the following slides. But just observe what's happened with your new sharing of this podcast. Does it get traction? Why or why not? Who is sharing it? What are they saying about it? If no one's sharing it, why are they not sharing it? And just observe what's happening. Try not to take it personally if no one cares, but that's really, really important to see if it really does have traction or not. And then you can adjust based on your findings. Now, none of this is rocket science, right? This is such a simple, straightforward concept of having a minimum viable product, or in this case, a minimum viable podcast. So what I really am trying to get across here, though, is if you are thinking of starting a podcast, you don't have to go from 0 to 100. You don't have to say, I'm either not doing a podcast or I'm doing a podcast for the rest of my life. You can do something that helps you test to see if there is a concept here that has legs. And then tied to all of this, as you're going through this process, make sure to set a specific metric that helps you determine whether this was a success or not. Of course, this is a little arbitrary, but this helps you actually determine, I think we should go forward with this project or we shouldn't. And this is the same activity that you would do if you were in a company and you're deciding whether to do one initiative or another. So just make sure to think about a podcast more like a business or a project than just this vague amorphous entity that you're either doing or you're not. Now, the second piece of advice is this idea of bite-sized content. So make sure to bite-size your content. As I mentioned, I think this is one of the most important things to keep in mind if you are thinking of distributing your podcast. Think about the customer journey of someone who subscribes to a podcast typically. Often it's a friend telling you about a podcast, or you reading about it somewhere, or you hearing about it to some extent, but often you need to hear about it many, many times before you actually give it a shot. Because as we've talked about before, most people already kind of have their little family of podcasts that they listen to, and the number is not that high. So if you are trying to get someone to listen to a new podcast and you perhaps don't even have that word of mouth yet, it's very, very difficult to get someone to say, I'm actually going to go and subscribe to this new podcast feed. That's a big leap, right? It's a tall order to ask someone to do that, to really buy into your podcast and all of your podcast future content before they've really had a chance to taste test anything. And so your job as a podcast creator is to lower the friction so that you can get more people to taste test and get a sense of what you're creating to help them reduce that friction. But also because as you bite-size this content, it allows you to leverage it for more channels. So here are some very concrete things that I encourage you to do if you're bite-sizing your content. The first is create a trailer episode. So think of Netflix. When you go onto Netflix, if there were no trailers for you to actually watch in your decision to watch a particular show, you would just go with the most popular shows or things that you've heard of or something that someone's recommended to you. The benefit of having a trailer is your ability to convince someone otherwise, to only take 30 seconds of their time and show them, well, this is really, really interesting. You should watch this. So especially if you're a new podcast, create a trailer so that people can get a sense of what you're actually creating, especially if they've never heard of you before. The second is related, where you're again creating short clips that people can participate with or see on different platforms like Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or YouTube that don't require them to listen to a whole 60 minutes of your podcast. So some people call these audiograms, but you want to create these. I think platforms like Descript at least let you create them on your own, but you can get a little more fancy if you hire people on Fiverr or other platforms that help you create them. And if you can do that, the benefit is that you can make your visuals a lot more recognizable. So you can see an example down here at the bottom of the guys at My First Million that have started to do this. But what's really important here is just this idea where you're allowing people to taste test your content without expecting them to go and subscribe to your entire podcast feed and listen to your full episode. You're kind of hitting them in many places on many different platforms. And as I mentioned, we are really limited as you're launching a podcast in the number of platforms that you can leverage to distribute it. And this, in bite-sizing it, allows you to use a lot of those platforms like Twitter or Instagram or TikTok. So make sure once you've created the bite-sized content to share it in those places. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are new platforms that are showing up. So we've talked about how the ecosystem is really, really early compared to the ecosystems of video or written content. Now, one of the platforms that I've used and really enjoyed is Shuffle. I'm not affiliated with Shuffle, but you are going to start to see more of these social listening apps start to emerge. And if you are creating a podcast, you may benefit from actually sharing your content on those listening apps so that people can actually comment or engage with particular sections. Again, this idea where you're not expecting them to listen or share an entire segment, but participate with discrete elements that they actually enjoy. The next thing is help your subscribers navigate to your best episodes or the best things that you've created. So the same way that you should create 30 to 60-second clips of your best 30 to 60 seconds segments, you should also help people navigate to your absolute best episodes. Most people just share things like their RSS feed, which just means you're as good as your most recent episode. What you really should do is create a podcast page, and we'll talk about this on the next slide. But on that podcast page, you should have your best episodes or your best segments so that you're hitting people with the best stuff first as they're discovering you and not hoping that your last episode is convincing enough. And then the final thing is that you can actually repurpose your audio content into other forms like written forms. Some people have a weekly newsletter for their podcasts. But the same way that you can take a newsletter and turn it into a podcast, you can do the reverse. And as we've talked about, the ability to share written content is a lot more diverse, and it's a lot easier, quite frankly, than podcast content or audio content. So that's something to keep in mind if you are thinking about that. And you can see an example down here where you see the All In Pod has grown immensely because of, well, one, it's a great pod, but also the following of the people on the pod, but they've also very effectively shared the content on different mediums like YouTube. You can see here their videos got 84,000 and 93,000 views in their recent episodes. So just keep in mind, make sure to bite size your content, make it easier for people to taste test your product effectively. That's what you're doing in creating these clips, and make sure to utilize those clips and share them across these different platforms. Because if not, how many times have you actually seen someone share a full length podcast episode on Twitter, for example, and you actually end up going to listen to it? It's very, very rare. But what you are starting to see is people sharing these clips, and that actually helps you convert people more slowly, perhaps, but more effectively to your podcast. Now, the next piece of advice, and I think this is the final kind of tier of the 3 tiers, is this concept that sounds vague, but is really important, of helping people help you. So if you want something, or if you want someone to help you grow your podcast, you want them to give you a review, you want them to share your podcast with someone else, you want them to subscribe, you want them to help you in some way, shape, or form. Well, you want to make it as easy as possible for them to actually do that. And podcasts, as we've talked about, are hard enough to scale on their own, so don't make it harder. So the first thing, and I'm just going to run through these very quickly because there's a lot here, is create a podcast page that features all of the places that people can subscribe. There's so many different apps you can see here, podcast listening apps. Of course, some of them have the most significant market share, but create a page that allows people to easily subscribe to any of the platforms that your podcast may exist or that they may participate in. And then, as I talked about just before this, don't just have it be a very basic RSS feed, because you are only as good as your most recent content in that case. Share your best episodes, and ideally, if you've created them, share your short clips so that people can taste test your content. If you're interested in creating a page like this, I am not affiliated with them, but you can see an example from Bootstrap Digest that use Transistor, which is a tool that really easily lets you create a page just like this. Once you've created this page, share that page. And again, not your Apple RSS feed or another RSS feed, because those quite simply are just going to be less effective at converting people to want to participate in your content. So if you're going to add it to your Twitter bio or share it in your newsletter, I would encourage you not to share the Apple link unless you're doing it for a very particular reason, as I'll talk about in a second. If you are running episodes and you do have some form of listenership, a lot of people ask for so many things from their listeners. At the end of an episode, they'll be like, subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and share with a friend and do X, Y, and Z. If you are running a podcast, at least at the beginning, do not overwhelm your users and ask for one very simple focused call to action. So the call to action will depend on what you actually need as a podcaster, but For example, you can ask them to review on a specific platform. You can ask them to share something very specific. So you can say, if you liked this section of the pod, share this with a friend. You can ask them to give feedback in a very specific place. So you can ask them to review on a very specific platform, or you can ask them to fill out a very specific form. But I'm saying specific a lot here because it's really important that you don't overwhelm people with 20 different things to do, and instead focus on one action that you would like them to take and focus solely on that. The next thing is a similar, along a similar line to what I just said, is growth hack one platform at a time. So your podcast rankings will differ on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something else, and that'll differ by location and many other different metrics. Start with one and focus on growing your listenership on one platform at a time, because that impacts your ability to increase your rankings on that particular platform one at a time, right? And so you're concentrating your effort in one place. So for example, there's a link in these slides that shows how sending traffic directly to Apple Podcasts and your links in Apple Podcasts increases your chances of trending there. So you might want to do some tests around that. This is not something that I've personally done myself, but it aligns with my previous growth hacking experience, where you don't want to just test out 50 different platforms at the same time. You want to focus on a couple, master them, and then move on to the next. We've talked about this already, but create recognizable cover art and intro music. These are just small things where you can help people help you, help them recognize you, and help them share your stuff and have others recognize you easily as well. Referral programs are such an essential part of really any product, any podcast, any newsletter, and they can be incredibly hard to track with podcasts in particular. There are tools. One of the ones that I've heard and used in the past is Rate This Podcast. So use that to actually simplify where you're directing people. You can also use a tool like Transistor to make sure that you're submitting to all of the podcast applications that we've talked about and that you can see on the left-hand side here. And you can also do things like submit your podcast to directories or search engines, but I will caveat and say that there aren't many today and they're not heavily used. So while you can go through the very basic step of doing that thing, I wouldn't say that you can necessarily expect a huge amount of growth from that. In fact, where I do think you'll get the most growth is what we talked about on the prior slide, where you're bite-sizing your content and sharing it on platforms where perhaps you already have an audience. And the final thing is, some of these are similar to what we've talked about with written content, is cross-promoting with other podcasts. If someone's listening to a podcast, they're more likely to be a person who listens to podcasts consistently and may be open to listening to yours. So you can use tools like Raphonic, which I've linked here as well. And there are some additional tips in the article from Transistor that I'm linking here in the slides. But overall, most of the time, all of these kind of micro growth hacks will not get you very far. They're not going to be step functions in your growth, but they're important to keep in mind. And as you're trying to grow, I would encourage you to revisit some of the content from Doing Content Right, because a lot of those growth tactics, a lot of the channels that we leverage are similar with audio, not necessarily the same, but if you bite-size your content, you can leverage many of the same growth tactics with audio. All right, we're almost done here, but the final thing I'll say on this section is just a quick note on monetization. So if you are looking to monetize your podcast, it's very similar in the sense that there are, in theory, many different ways to monetize content, but there is a primary way that people tend to monetize content. And with podcasts, it tends to be through ads. And so if you are interested in monetization, I would direct you back to the monetization section of Doing Content Right, because there isn't necessarily anything new or revolutionary today about the way that podcasts monetize. A lot of them monetize through ads. Some of them gate their pods, although I think that is quite rare today. And some of them ask for donations. There's other ways that you can monetize, but overall, I think a strong majority still monetize through advertisements. And I would say that you should look out for new ways to monetize podcasts. And I think we're going to see that emerge in the next couple of years as we see many other things in the audio space emerge. But one thing I wanted to call out, which I called out in the section about written content, is that if you choose to gate your content, and this is true for a newsletter and true for a podcast, just keep in mind that you are making it much harder for yourself to grow, right? Anytime you're putting the value behind a paywall, you make it that much harder for you to actually get attention around a particular thing. So there are tools today like Supercast that allow you to gate audio content, but just keep that in mind if you're interested in it. All right, so that was it in terms of chapter 3 or section 3 of the bonus section for podcasting. If you do have questions, definitely feel free to message me, but I would encourage you to revisit the distribution section of doing content right. But overall, if I just kind of pivot very quickly back to one of the first slides in this section, I really want to emphasize this idea of creating an MVP and not treating your podcast as a single idea that never changes over time. One quick example that I'll actually share there is My First Million started as an interview style podcast that Sean did where he invited on guests, and they did a couple episodes where Sam and Sean just kind of riffed on ideas, and based on the data and the feedback that they got, they saw that people actually preferred that, and that's what the podcast has become today. So really emphasizing this idea of creating a minimum viable podcast, getting feedback, tracking success, and iterating as needed is really important. Creating bite-sized shareable content that can be distributed effectively. And then this idea where it's already hard enough to grow a podcast, so don't make it any harder on yourself. Help people help you achieve that. All right, in the final section, we will very quickly dive into a couple questions from the audience. But until then, I will leave it there.